Hi, my name's Kylie Fowler, and my friend Rory Canavan has asked me to present the joiners, movers and leavers process. Now, when I said he asked me to present the joiners, movers and leavers process, what actually happened was he said to me, "Kylie, would you like to present some processes?" And I said, "Oh yes please." And he said, "Which ones?" And I said, "Oh, joiners, movers and leavers please." And the reason I was so keen to do this one is because it's a really challenging process, but if you get it right, it's got huge benefits for the entire organisation. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to talk about the primary and secondary objectives and assumptions. We're going to walk through the process itself. We're going to discuss the potential banana skins that might make us slip up, say thank you to our sponsors, and then look at what's coming up next. So the primary objective of the movers, joiners, leavers process is to update the ownership status of IT assets at key points of a staff member's employee lifecycle. And I think actually the critical point about this objective is not so much the IT asset bit as the staff member's employee lifecycle. There's a couple of points about this. Firstly, we're not really just restricting ourselves to employees. We do need to ensure that this process applies to contractors and third parties who utilise our equipment. Now, the second thing about this objective is actually there's a large number of other business units, both in the organisation as a whole and within IT, who also need to do something similar. So in IT asset management, we need to make sure that we know which employees are using which assets, IT assets. But if you think about it, in HR, payroll team need to make sure that they're paying the right people the right amount. You might have a fleet department which gives employees who are entitled to it company vehicles, and they need to manage those vehicles as well. Finance need to manage corporate credit cards and make sure that they get credit cards back from people who leave so that it limits the ability of those employees to steal money from the company. And facilities management, of course, needs to provide desk space to employees and make sure that when employees leave, they know that that desk has now become free so that somebody else can use it. Within IT, information security needs to understand who's joining and leaving and moving around the company to ensure that the appropriate access controls are in place. The service desk, which logs calls and provides IT support to people, needs to know who it is they're supporting, and it's helpful to know what equipment they're using and what access they have to our IT systems. And finally, in many organisations, IT finance need to know which employees are using which services in order to ensure that those are cross-charged appropriately to the business units they work for. So you can see it's actually a really big process. We only see a snippet of it, just the bits that relate to IT assets. But there's a lot of people in your organisation that are going to be facing similar problems that you are. Even though they're not managing IT assets, they're still managing things that relate to employees and contractors. So the secondary objectives of this process are that it interfaces with the lost stolen process so that we understand when our IT assets are stolen and can do a risk assessment regarding the information on those assets and the risks that might pose to the business. We also need to try and make staff members accountable for the IT assets issued to them, and we also want to make sure we get those IT assets back at the end of that employee's time with the company. So in order to do these process diagrams, Rory has made a couple of assumptions, and I'm just going to talk around them a little bit because they're quite important, and hopefully this discussion will provide some food for thought. In the diagrams that follow, you will see an HR system. It's in green, and you see it several times on each page. Now what that actually is a database that aligns employee information with IT asset information. We could also use a database that aligns employee information to company car information or credit card information or desk locations. So we say that it's an HR system because actually the core piece of that is what is it that employees are doing or using. So that's why we're saying that actually the HR system is preferred to be used over a CMDB or an IT service management tool for this. But depending on what stakeholders you have involved in working on this process, you may find that actually what you want is a standalone database and you import information from HR systems, or actually you might not have any stakeholders or anybody working on this process from outside IT, in which case maybe your IT service management tool is the most appropriate tool. I would really strongly recommend that you do try and get a feed from HR systems into whatever database it is that you use to manage the employee relationships to assets or credit cards or whatever. And the reason I say that is because HR is a very tightly regulated part of the organisation. Their entire raison d'etre is to understand what employees are employed by the company, how much they're being paid, where they're working, where their line manager is, etc. And although we may make jokes about the accuracy of HR data, the reality is that because they're so highly regulated, if they get it wrong, if they pay somebody the wrong amount, they're going to be subject to significant regulatory penalties. So they really take a lot of pains to get it right. But equally, they do have a lot of very highly personal and protected data that they need to manage. So they're going to be very reluctant to allow feeds into their system. So you do need to really work with them to help them understand that you don't need personal sensitive information, you just need names and employee numbers perhaps, and that the benefits of taking advantage of that data are really significant, not just for IT, but for a lot of other areas of the company as well. You also need to remember that you're going to have to bolt on non-employees into this system somehow, because you do still need to manage the IT assets that are being used by contractors and third parties, and information security needs to manage access for those people as well. And quite possibly facilities management needs to be able to find desks for them. So HR data is not the be-all and end-all, but actually it is a huge advantage if you can get it. Now, the third assumption we're making here is that line managers take responsibility for updating the HR database. So maintaining that relationship between what employees are using, between the employees and what they're using. Now, this is something that as an IT person, you're going to struggle to get that policy in place. So again, you need to work with HR who can do that. They're the ones that can actually say to everybody with line management responsibility in the organisation, it's your responsibility to make sure that IT assets are repatriated when one of your employees leaves. So let's actually walk through the process itself. So the process is triggered when we get a new employee or a new contractor or a new third party needs access. Somebody needs to be responsible for assessing what equipment, in the case of IT asset management, or what access for information security is required by that individual. So if it's an employee or a contractor, it will be the line manager or the person who's engaged that contractor. If it's a third party, it would be whoever has requested that these people be allowed access to our systems. So we do an assessment of what is required, and basically we give them their equipment. And when the equipment is handed over, somebody has to make sure that the relationship between that individual and that piece of equipment is updated in what we're calling the HR system. But remember, it might not actually be the HR system. So employees might work at a company for a month, or they might work there for a few days, or they might work there for their entire career. But throughout their career, the equipment that they use is likely to change. Potentially, and this is up in the top right-hand corner, they might have their equipment lost or stolen. So this is where we need to have connections through to the lost or stolen process and ensure that we understand what was stolen so we can do a risk assessment about the information that was on that equipment. If somebody's been using a laptop or a desktop for maybe 5 years, it's getting old, it's not working so well, it's no longer compatible with newer software, we might want to upgrade it. So that's where we would then connect with the hardware procurement process. But no matter what happens, we need to ensure that the employee and the IT asset relationship is updated. We register the fact that the employee is no longer using the old equipment, and we ensure that we register the new equipment as being used by that person. So the other thing that might happen is that the employee might move. They might change their job role or their department, and so therefore they've got a new line manager. They may need different equipment, and also they may need different access to systems. So again, we need to understand what it is they need to give up and what it is that they need to gain in order to do their new job properly. And again, in the case of IT assets, we need to ensure that the relationship between the assets they're using and that individual is always kept up to date. And this is where the line managers, we're making the assumption here that the line managers will do this. But in your organisation, it may be somebody different. As always, we need to make sure that that HR system is updated. Now, at some point, because we all will shuffle off this mortal coil, the employee will leave the company. So we need to understand what equipment needs to be returned. And again, we're making the assumption that the line manager is responsible for ensuring that that equipment is actually returned. As software asset managers, we may also know that they need to have some software as a service or platform as a service services to be suspended. And also there will almost certainly be other access to IT systems that need to be suspended as well. And as always, we need to update that HR system or that database that maintains those relationships. Now, it may be that the equipment is retained by the line manager for a new staff member, in which case the line manager needs to update the relationship to show that that asset is being used by the new person. The equipment may be returned to the IT department, in which case, again, we need to update what has happened to it. Have we decided that it's a bit old, so we're going to dispose of it, or are we going to redeploy it to somebody else? So as always, and central to this process, is we really need to update our HR systems. So what are the potential banana skins that might trip us up? Firstly, we never actually check that the relationship between assets and people is correct. And this is something which actually has a relationship to maintaining our asset register. So if you imagine that we have a set of assets that is owned by our company, some of them are going to be in a storeroom waiting to be deployed because they're new. The vast majority is actually going to be in active use by individuals. And some of the equipment will again be in a storeroom waiting to be decommissioned and disposed of. So what we need to do is maintain the accuracy of our HR system or the database that maintains those relationships so that we can actually do an analysis to identify what's in the storeroom, what's been assigned to people, what's about to be decommissioned, and then identify assets that actually we're not quite sure where they are. So you can see this joiners, movers, leavers process is actually really quite key to maintaining the overall accuracy of our asset register as well. And there's tricks that we can use to make sure that we do maintain those relationships accurately. For instance, we can ping machines, we can send out questionnaires to individuals asking them to tell us what assets they're using. We can look at our discovery tool to see who's regularly logging into machines, and if that's not the login name of the person we think is using it, we go and investigate what the problem might be. You might also find that line managers don't view this as their responsibility, and we did discuss this briefly at the beginning of the talk. This is where you need to work with HR to change this. HR are the people who provide policies to line managers about what they have to do in relation to the people they're managing. So if you can get the fact that they are responsible for repatriating equipment when people leave in those HR policies, then you're going to find your life is much easier because line managers won't be able to wriggle out of it. And finally, end users fail to report lost or stolen devices. So this is a perennial problem, but I think the trick is to understand why it's important that we know that a piece of equipment has been lost or stolen. And it's no longer about the value of that equipment. You know, these days laptops might cost £500 or £800. It's peanuts in the context of a large organisation. We're really not worried about the fact that we need to buy a new one, but we are worried about the data on that laptop. So my message is make it as easy as possible for end users to report lost or stolen devices. Don't make them feel guilty. Seriously consider whether you need them to fill in a police report, for instance. Just take it as read and focus on understanding what information is on that laptop and whether it poses risks to the organisation. So that is our joiners, movers, leavers process in a nutshell, and I hope that you enjoyed it and that it's been helpful. It's a really interesting process because it's got so many stakeholders across the entire organisation. So if you get it right, it's extremely satisfying. So at this point, we'd like to say thank you to our sponsors, and also at the bottom of this page, you'll see the URL for the SAM Charter Process Kit. This is one of just many processes that is documented in that process kit, which you can purchase and download from the SAM Charter website. Next month, we're going to be covering the orphan data process. And in the meantime, if you have any questions or comments or queries, please contact Rory. There's his email address. You can also follow him on Twitter, and there is his LinkedIn address as well. And if he's anything like me, he'll be very happy to link in with any software asset managers who send an invitation. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you later.